At 35,000 feet somewhere over the middle of the country, the first-class cabin went silent the moment flight attendant Angela Brooks snatched the ticket from the man sitting alone in seat 2A. She tore it in half then again and let the pieces fall while every passenger watched. "Someone like you could never afford this seat," she said. "You stole it." The man didn't argue. He didn't even raise his voice. He only looked at the torn paper on the floor. Angela had no idea she'd just ended her own career. The flight from New York to Los Angeles boarded under a gray morning sky, and Caleb Lawson was one of the first passengers to find his seat. He moved through the cabin without hurry, a man in his middle 30s, wearing a plain dark sweater, worn jeans and shoes that had clearly walked a great deal. He carried only a single canvas bag, the kind a person might use for groceries. Nothing about him asked to be noticed, and that was exactly how he preferred it. He slid into seat 2A by the window, set the bag at his feet, and looked out at the slow ballet of luggage carts on the tarmac below. Caleb had spent the better part of a decade building something out of almost nothing. There had been years that ended in failure, years that cost him more than money, and a long stretch when he learned what it meant to carry the weight of a household alone. That history had not made him loud. If anything, it had taught him the opposite, that the people who shouted the most were usually the ones with the least to defend. So he sat quietly, content to disappear into the hum of the engines and the murmur of a cabin filling up around him. Across the aisle and a few steps forward, Angela Brooks was already at work. She had served on these routes for nearly 15 years, long enough to believe she could read a person the moment they stepped through the cabin door. She prided herself on it, in fact, the way some people prided themselves on a good memory or a firm handshake. To Angela, first class was not merely a section of the aircraft, it was a category of human being, and she considered herself its quiet guardian. She greeted the passengers she approved of with a warmth that bordered on theatrical. A man in a tailored suit received a champagne flute and a compliment about his watch. A woman draped in soft cashmere got a blanket folded just so, and a promise that her meal would be served first. Angela remembered names, or pretended to, and she moved through the front of the plane like a hostess in her own home, deciding who belonged and who was merely passing through. When her eyes reached seat 2, a something in her expression tightened. She took in the worn sweater, the canvas bag, the absence of any gold or polished leather case. There was no expensive watch on his wrist, no laptop bearing a corporate logo, none of the small signals she had trained herself to recognize. To her, Caleb Lawson did not look like a man who belonged in the second row of a transcontinental flight. He looked, she decided, like a man who had wandered into the wrong part of the airplane. Caleb felt the weight of her stare before he turned to meet it. It was a familiar sensation, one he had carried through boardrooms where men assumed he was the assistant, through restaurants where he was seated near the kitchen, through countless rooms where his appearance arrived before his name ever could. He gave Angela a small, polite nod, the kind a person offers a stranger, and then returned his gaze to the window. He had learned long ago that explaining himself rarely changed anyone's mind. The other passenger settled in. A businessman named Gerald Pruitt across the aisle opened a newspaper and snapped it flat with the satisfaction of a man who enjoyed the sound. Several rows back, a woman named Diane Foster slid her phone from her bag and rested it in her lap out of habit, not yet aware she would use it for anything. The cabin reached that quiet equilibrium of pre-flight, the seatbelt chime, the recorded safety announcement, the slow push back from the gate. Caleb closed his eyes and let the takeoff press him gently into his seat as the city fell away beneath them. For the first hour, the flight passed without incident. The seatbelt sign blinked off, and Angela began her rounds with the beverage cart distributing drinks to her chosen few with practiced grace. When she reached row 2, she leaned slightly toward Gerald Pruitt and offered him a selection of premium options listing them by name. Then she turned to Caleb and her voice changed entirely, flattening into something cool and clipped, as though serving him were a chore beneath her station. "Can I see your boarding pass?" she said. It was not a question. Caleb opened his eyes and regarded her for a moment, then reached into the inner pocket of his sweater and produced the printed ticket, smooth and unremarkable. He held it out to her. Angela took it between two fingers, studied it longer than necessary, turned it over, and frowned as though the paper itself had insulted her. The seat number was correct. The name matched. And yet she could not let it go. "This says 2D," she said loud enough now that the nearest passengers glanced up. "That's this seat." Caleb nodded once. "That's right." She held the ticket against the light from the window, examining it with theatrical suspicion. "We've had problems lately," she announced, to no one in particular and to everyone at once, "with people moving up from the back, people who think no one will check." Her eyes flicked over his sweater again, his bag, the entirety of him, and she let the implication hang in the air like smoke. Caleb understood exactly what she was saying. He had heard it phrased 100 different ways across his life, but never quite this publicly. Never quite this early in the morning at 35,000 feet. He kept his voice even. "The ticket is mine. I bought it. I'm sitting in the seat that's printed on it." A few heads had turned now. Gerald Pruitt lowered his newspaper. The murmur of the cabin thinned into something more attentive, and Angela, sensing the audience, drew herself up taller. "I'm going to need you to come with me," she said. "We can sort this out in the back, away from the other guests." The phrase "the other guests" landed precisely as she intended, drawing a clean line between Caleb and everyone she considered legitimate. Caleb did not move. "There's nothing to sort out," he said quietly. "You're holding a valid ticket with my name on it. If you'd like to verify it, you're welcome to. But I'm not leaving my seat." Something about his calm seemed only to inflame her further, as though his refusal to be flustered confirmed every suspicion she'd already decided to have. It was then that Angela did the thing the cabin would remember for a long time afterward. She looked down at the ticket in her hand, looked back at the man who refused to perform the role she had assigned him, and she tore it. The sound of paper splitting cut through the low drone of the engines. She tore it again into quarters, her movements quick and certain, and then she opened her fingers and let the pieces drift down onto the carpet between his shoes. "There," she said. "Now there's no ticket. So unless you can prove this seat is yours, I'd suggest you find somewhere else to sit." A woman 2 rows back gasped audibly. Gerald Pruitt's mouth opened, then closed. Several rows behind them, Diane Foster lifted her phone above the seat back without a word, and somewhere across the aisle, a second camera joined hers. The cabin had become an audience, and Angela, mistaking their attention for support, lifted her chin as though she had just won something. Caleb looked down at the torn pieces of his ticket scattered across the floor. For a long moment, he said nothing at all. The expected reaction, the one Angela was braced for, was anger. The raised voice of a man humiliated in public, the kind of outburst that would have justified everything she was about to do. But it never came. Instead, Caleb simply looked at the ruined paper with an expression that was almost sorrowful, as if he were mourning something larger than a boarding pass. "You shouldn't have done that," he said at last, and his voice was so quiet that the passengers leaned in to hear it. There was no threat in the words. There was something almost like warning, the way a person might tell someone they were standing too close to an edge they couldn't see. Angela laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Is that supposed to scare me? I've been doing this job longer than you've been able to afford a plane ticket." She turned toward the front of the cabin. "I'm calling it in. We'll have security waiting at the gate." This was the moment the situation tipped into something that could not be undone. Angela strode to the forward galley and lifted the interphone, and her voice carried back into the cabin in fragments, suspicious, passenger possible, fraudulent boarding, requesting law enforcement on arrival. She spoke with the confidence of someone who believed the system would always take her side, because in 15 years, it always had. She was not reporting an incident. She was building a case, and she intended to win it before the wheels ever touched the ground. Back in seat 2, Caleb faced a choice, though no one watching could have known it. He had, in that exact moment, the power to end the entire scene with a single sentence. He could have named who he was. He could have asked Angela to look up a particular name in the airline's own records and watch the color drain from her face. The truth was sitting in his chest like a key in a lock, and all he had to do was turn it. But Caleb had spent his life being underestimated, and he had learned something the comfortable rarely understood: that the way a person treats someone they believe to be powerless reveals everything about who they truly are. Angela did not yet know who he was, and so this right now was the most honest version of her he would ever see. He decided he would not give her the easy escape of suddenly discovering his importance. Not yet. He wanted to see how far she would carry this on her own. So when Angela returned and informed him with visible satisfaction that officers would be meeting the aircraft and that he should prepare to be removed, Caleb only nodded slowly. "All right," he said, "but I'd like to speak with the captain, and I'd like everything that's happening here documented properly by the airline on the record." The request was so reasonable, so utterly without panic, that it momentarily disrupted Angela's rhythm. She had expected pleading or rage. She had not expected a man asking calmly for the proper procedure to be followed. "The captain doesn't come back here for passenger disputes," she said, recovering. "And there's nothing to document except that you're refusing to cooperate." Caleb folded his hands in his lap. "I'm not refusing anything. I'm sitting in my assigned seat, and I've asked for the chain of command to be involved and for a written record to be kept. If you'd put that request through, I'd appreciate it." He spoke the way a man speaks when he has been in difficult rooms before, and learned that the calmest person in them is usually the one who walks out unharmed. Gerald Pruitt, watching from across the aisle, found himself unsettled in a way he couldn't name. He had assumed, like everyone else, that the man in the worn sweater was exactly what Angela said he was. But people who were guilty did not ask for documentation. People who were guilty did not invite the captain into the conversation. They wanted fewer witnesses, not more. Pruitt lowered his newspaper entirely now and simply watched. The first of several passengers beginning to suspect that the wrong person was on trial. Up and down the cabin, opinions were quietly dividing. Some passengers, taking their cue from Angela's uniform and her certainty, decided the man must have done something to deserve this. A few muttered agreement, glad to have a villain to point at. But others, the ones who had actually been listening, noticed what Pruitt had noticed, that the accused man had done nothing but produce his ticket and ask for fairness, while the accuser had been the one to destroy the only evidence with her own hands. The phones kept recording. Diane Foster's, then a second, then a third. From somewhere in the row behind her, each capturing the scene from a slightly different angle, each preserving the image of an attendant who had torn a passenger's ticket apart and now stood over him demanding proof of something she had just destroyed. None of those passengers knew what the footage would become. They only knew, in the instinctive way people sense a storm before it breaks, that they were watching something that mattered. Angela, for her part, felt only the clean certainty of being right. She returned to the galley to finish her report, already composing in her mind the version of events she would tell her supervisors, the version in which she was the vigilant professional protecting her aircraft from a man who didn't belong. She had been praised for vigilance before. She expected to be praised again. The thought that she might have made a mistake did not occur to her, because in 15 years of judging people by their shoes and their watches, she had never once been told she was wrong. Caleb sat in his window seat with the torn pieces of his ticket still on the floor and the wide country sliding by beneath the clouds. He was not afraid of the security officers waiting at the gate, because he understood something Angela did not. He knew that the moment the captain ran his name through the airline's own system, the entire shape of this story would invert, and the woman currently so sure of her power would discover precisely how little of it she actually held. But he took no pleasure in that knowledge. What he felt mostly was a tired kind of recognition. He had hoped, boarding this flight, that he might simply be a passenger for a few hours, anonymous and unbothered, a man going from one coast to another. Instead, he had been handed one more reminder of how quickly the world decided a person's worth by the fabric of his sweater. He looked at the ruined ticket on the carpet and thought with quiet resolve that this time the lesson would not be his alone to learn. The aircraft droned westward. 3 hours of flight still lay ahead, and somewhere in the cockpit, a captain named Daniel Reyes was about to receive a request that would change the trajectory of 2 lives. Angela believed the matter was already settled. Caleb knew it had not yet begun, and the passengers between them, phones in hand, sat in the strange electric quiet of people who realize they have become witnesses to something they will be talking about long after they land. Angela was not finished. Having reported Caleb to the ground, she decided the safest way to protect herself was to make the case against him as complete as possible before the aircraft landed. She returned to row 2 with a clipboard and a printed incident form, and she began asking questions in a voice loud enough to ensure the surrounding passengers heard every word. Where had he boarded? Who had issued his ticket? Whether he had been drinking? Each question was framed not to gather information, but to plant suspicion, and she wrote his answers down with the slow deliberation of someone constructing evidence. I'm noting that the passenger was uncooperative and could not produce a valid boarding pass, she said aloud as she wrote the pen scratching across the form. Caleb watched her hand move. You tore the boarding pass, he said evenly. It was valid until you destroyed it. I'd like that noted too. Angela did not look up. What I'm noting, she replied, is that you became a disruption in the cabin. That's what matters for security. She had decided on the story, and now she was simply fitting the facts to it. She moved up the aisle to speak with the lead flight attendant, a younger man named Marcus Webb, and Caleb could hear the shape of her argument drifting back to him. She was telling Webb that she was protecting the flight, that she had a responsibility to the other passengers, that men like the one in 2A counted on people being too polite to question them. She wrapped her judgment in the language of duty, and it was persuasive precisely because it sounded so responsible. Webb listened, frowning, clearly uncertain whether to trust her certainty or his own unease. The strategy worked, at least for a while. A handful of passengers, who had only half watched the incident, now accepted Angela's framing, because the version in which a vigilant attendant caught a fraud was simpler than the version in which a professional had humiliated an innocent man over the color of his sweater. A man in a gray jacket several rows back muttered that you couldn't be too careful these days. A woman near the galley nodded along, glad to believe the uniform. Caleb found himself increasingly alone in a cabin that had an hour earlier simply been full of strangers. It was a particular kind of isolation, and Caleb knew it well. He had felt it in waiting rooms and lobbies, in the way conversations cooled when he entered and warmed when he left. The difference now was the altitude, and the audience, the sense of being put on display while a woman in authority narrated his guilt to a captive crowd. He kept his hands folded and his breathing slow. He had decided not to use the one weapon that would end this instantly, and holding that decision required more discipline than any words ever could. But the tide was not entirely against him. Across the aisle, Gerald Pruitt had been quietly seething since the moment the ticket hit the floor, and he was not a man accustomed to staying quiet. He leaned toward the woman beside him and said plainly that he had seen the whole thing, that the attendant had ripped up the man's ticket with her own hands, and that there was nothing fraudulent about producing a ticket and being told it didn't count. His voice carried. A few passengers who had drifted toward Angela's version began quietly to drift back. Several rows behind Diane Foster had been recording from the very beginning. Her phone braced against the seat back in front of her, and she now had a continuous, unbroken video of the entire encounter. She had not announced herself. She simply kept filming, capturing Angela's voice, the tearing of the paper, the scattered pieces on the carpet, and Caleb's refusal to so much as raise his voice. She did not yet know what she would do with it. She only knew, with the instinct of someone who had watched an injustice unfold, that this was something that should not be allowed to disappear. In the cockpit, Captain Daniel Reyes had received Angela's report and found himself troubled by it. He had flown for more than 20 years, and he had learned to read his crew the way Angela believed she could read passengers. Something in the report did not sit right. The man had not made threats. He had not been intoxicated. He had, according to the report itself, asked repeatedly for documentation and for the captain to be involved. In Reyes's long experience, guilty people did not behave that way. They wanted the matter dropped, not recorded. Reyes also knew that a passenger asking by name to speak with the captain and to have an incident formally documented was either a fool or a man who understood exactly how these situations were supposed to work. The man in 2A did not sound like a fool, so the captain made a decision that would prove decisive, rather than simply accept Angela's account and let security handle it on the ground. He instructed Marcus Webb to gather the passenger's full name and to relay it forward so that ground operations could verify the booking before any officers were committed. Webb made his way back to row 2 visibly uncomfortable and crouched beside Caleb's seat. "Sir, I'm sorry to trouble you," he said, lowering his voice in a way Angela never had. "The captain would like to verify your reservation directly with our ground team. Could you give me your full name as it appears on the booking?" Caleb looked at the young man for a moment, recognizing in him the discomfort of someone who suspected a wrong was being committed and didn't yet know how to stop it. "Caleb Lawson," he said simply, Lawson. Webb wrote it down and carried it forward to the cockpit, and from there it traveled through the aircraft's communication system down to the airline's operations center on the ground. There, an agent entered the name into the company's internal records, expecting to find a routine economy passenger who had somehow ended up in the wrong seat. What appeared on the screen instead made the agent stop, read it again, and then immediately phone a supervisor, because the name attached to seat 2A was not in the system as an ordinary passenger at all. It took several minutes for the information to climb back up the chain and reach Captain Reyes, and when it did, his expression changed in the privacy of the cockpit. The man sitting in seat 2A, the man Angela Brooks had publicly accused of stealing his seat, was Caleb Lawson, the founder of the investment fund that held one of the largest ownership stakes in the very airline operating this flight. More than that, his name appeared in the company's own internal documents as a strategic advisor on the board's Customer Experience Restructuring Committee. In other words, the man Angela had decided could not afford a first-class seat was in a meaningful sense one of the people who owned the airplane. He was not merely a wealthy passenger who could file a complaint. He was a figure with direct influence over the company's leadership, its policies, and the careers of the people who worked for it. The agent on the ground understood the gravity instantly. So did Captain Reyes. The only people on the aircraft who still did not understand were Angela Brooks and the passengers she had convinced to take her side. Reyes did something he rarely did mid-flight. He handed control to his first officer unbuckled and walked back into the cabin himself. The appearance of the captain in the aisle sent a ripple through the passengers, who straightened in their seats and fell quiet. Angela, seeing him approach, assumed he had come to validate her judgment, and she stepped forward with her clipboard, ready to present her case. "Captain, I have the incident fully documented. Security can take him at the gate. I've already—" Reyes raised a hand, not unkindly, but firmly enough to stop her. "Ms. Brooks," he said, his voice low and controlled, I'd like you to step to the galley with me for a moment." He turned to Caleb before she could respond, and what he said next rearranged the entire cabin's understanding of the last hour. "Mr. Lawson, I want to apologize on behalf of this crew. We've verified your booking, and there has clearly been a serious mistake. I'm going to make sure it's handled properly." He spoke the name Lawson clearly deliberately so that it carried. The effect was immediate. Gerald Pruitt let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. The passengers who had taken Angela's side exchanged glances, the certainty draining from their faces as they recalculated everything they had assumed. And Angela herself stood frozen near the galley, the clipboard suddenly heavy in her hands, watching the captain of the aircraft apologize to the man she had spent the last hour trying to have arrested. The name meant nothing to her yet, but the captain's tone meant everything, and she felt the first cold stirrings of a fear she could not yet name. She followed Reyes to the forward galley, where he spoke to her quietly, but without softness. He told her who Caleb Lawson was. He told her about the ownership stake, about the advisory role, about the fact that she had publicly accused and attempted to detain one of the most influential figures connected to the airline, all because of how he was dressed. He watched the understanding arrive on her face, in stages, disbelief, then denial, then the slow horror of a person realizing the ground beneath them has already given way. "That's not possible," she said, her voice thinner than before. "He doesn't look like—" She stopped herself because the end of that sentence was the entire problem, and some part of her recognized it even now. Reyes regarded her steadily. "He doesn't look like what Ms. Brooks—" The question did not require an answer. It only required her to hear how the sentence would have ended, and to understand that her entire judgment had been built on the half of that thought she had never said out loud. But even now cornered, Angela reached for the defense she had relied on her whole career. "I was following security protocol," she said. "We're trained to flag passengers who seem out of place. I was protecting the flight. If anything, I should be commended for taking it seriously." She straightened her jacket as she spoke, rebuilding her certainty piece by piece, because the alternative that she had simply been cruel to an innocent man was something she was not yet willing to hold. Reyes did not argue with her in the galley. He did not need to because the argument was already being made elsewhere, in a place neither of them could control. While Angela was reciting the language of protocol, Diane Foster's video was being uploaded over the aircraft's wireless connection, sent out into a network where strangers by the thousands would soon watch a flight attendant tear a man's ticket apart and stand over him, demanding he account for evidence she herself had destroyed. The footage did not contain the word protocol anywhere in it. It contained only what she had done. What the video showed could not be reconciled with the story Angela was telling. It showed her leaning into row 2 and looking the man over before she ever asked for his pass. It showed her tearing the ticket without provocation, her face certain and almost satisfied. It showed Caleb producing valid documentation and asking calmly for fairness, while she narrated his guilt to the cabin. There was no protocol visible in any frame. There was only a professional humiliating a passenger she had decided on sight didn't belong. Within the cabin itself, the other crew members had begun to talk among themselves, and their conversation took a turn that Angela would not have wanted to hear. Marcus Webb quietly mentioned to a colleague that this was not the first time he had seen Angela treat certain passengers with open contempt. Another attendant recalled a complaint from a previous flight that had gone nowhere. In the span of a single conversation, a pattern was taking shape. The outline of a history that Angela had assumed was buried and forgotten. By the time Captain Reyes returned to the cockpit, the machinery of consequence was already in motion, though Angela could not see it. The Ground Operations Center, having identified who Caleb Lawson was, had escalated the incident to the airline's corporate offices. A message had gone out. The company's internal review process, the same one Caleb had quietly advised on, was being activated against one of its own employees. And the irony of that was not lost on the small group of people who understood the full picture. Caleb, still in seat 2A, was aware of almost none of these specifics, but he could feel the change in the cabin's atmosphere, the way the air shifts before weather turns. The captain had spoken his name. The passengers who had judged him were now avoiding his eyes. Marcus Webb returned to row 2 once more, this time not to question him, but to offer a sincere and visibly shaken apology, his voice low and his face pale. Caleb accepted it with a small nod, holding no anger toward the young man who had only been caught in someone else's mistake. What Caleb felt sitting there as the aircraft began its long descent toward the coast was not triumph. He had known how this would end, the moment Angela tore the ticket, because he had seen the system work this way, before, just never in his own favor, so completely. What occupied his mind instead was the question of what to do with the outcome. He could destroy Angela Brooks. The power to do so was real and immediate, requiring nothing more than a phone call once he landed. But he understood that contempt was rarely cured by more of the same. Angela meanwhile returned to the cabin to finish the descent, in a silence that felt entirely different from the one she had commanded an hour before. The passengers who had supported her would not meet her eyes now. The ones who had doubted her watched her with open judgment. She went through the motions of securing the cabin for landing, checking seat belts and tray tables, but her hands were not entirely steady, and every time she passed row 2 she felt the weight of what she had done, pressing against the story she still desperately wanted to believe. She told herself it would be fine. She told herself the airline would understand, that she had acted in good faith, that a misunderstanding was not the same as misconduct, that 15 years of service had to count for something. But underneath those reassurances ran a colder current, the dawning awareness that the man in the worn sweater had never once raised his voice, had asked only for documentation and fairness, and had warned her gently that she should not have torn his ticket. She had laughed at that warning. Now, as the runway lights rose to meet the descending aircraft, she was beginning to understand that he had not been threatening her at all. He had been telling her the truth. The wheels touched the tarmac at Los Angeles with a long, shuddering sigh, and the aircraft slowed toward its gate. Somewhere in the terminal, instead of the security officers Angela had requested to detain Caleb, a different group of people was waiting, summoned by the corporate office, ready to begin an inquiry that would not be about the man in 2A at all. Angela believed the ordeal was nearly over. In truth, for her, it was only just beginning, and the realization of that was waiting for her the moment the cabin doors opened. By the time the cabin doors opened at Los Angeles, the video had already begun its life in the world. It had gone out during the descent, and by the time passengers were reaching for their bags, it had been viewed tens of thousands of times. The footage was clear and damning a flight attendant destroying a man's ticket and demanding he account for it, a passenger answering only with calm. Within hours, the count would climb into the millions, and the airline would find itself at the center of a storm it had not seen coming. Angela noticed the change before she understood it. As the passengers filed off the aircraft, several of them looked at her, not with the deference she was accustomed to, but with something between disgust and pity. A woman near the front stopped just long enough to say that she should be ashamed of herself. Gerald Pruitt, passing the galley, did not say anything at all, which somehow landed harder than if he had. Angela stood by the door, performing the ritual of farewell to people who no longer wanted anything to do with her. When she finally stepped into the jet bridge herself, she was met not by the security officer she had requested for Caleb, but by 2 representatives from the airline's corporate office and a member of the regional management team. They were polite, and they were firm. They informed her that an incident had been reported, that footage was already circulating publicly, and that she was being asked to remain available for an immediate internal inquiry. Her access to the crew scheduling system, they added, had been temporarily suspended, pending review. The words landed on her one by one. Suspended. Inquiry. Footage. She heard herself begin to protest, to explain about protocol and vigilance, and 15 years of service. But the representatives only listened with the neutral patience of people who had already seen the video and drawn their own conclusions. Whatever story she had built at 35,000 feet did not survive contact with the ground. The system she had trusted her entire career to protect her was now turning its attention. Methodically and without sentiment toward her, inside the terminal, the airline was already in crisis. The video had been picked up and shared by accounts with enormous reach, and the comment sections had become a referendum, not just on one flight attendant, but on the way people are judged by their appearance, by their clothing, by the assumptions strangers make in an instant. Former passengers began surfacing with their own stories, some about Angela specifically, others about similar treatment they had endured and never reported. The pattern that Marcus Webb had hinted at on the aircraft was now assembling itself in public post by post. The company's communications team scrambled to respond. The footage was too clear to deny and too widespread to ignore, and every hour of silence made the situation worse. Executives who had never heard Angela Brooks's name were now in urgent meetings about her trying to understand how a routine flight had become a national conversation about prejudice and dignity. And running beneath all of it was a complication they could not avoid: the fact that the passenger at the center of the story was not an ordinary customer, but a man whose name appeared on their own ownership documents. Caleb, for his part, had walked off the aircraft and into a situation he had never wanted. He had hoped to land quietly and disappear into the city, but the video had made that impossible. By the time he reached the terminal, his name was attached to the story, and the people who recognized it understood that the man wronged in the footage was also a man with the power to reshape the company that had wronged him. Reporters would soon be calling. The airline's leadership would soon be asking, nervously, what he intended to do. It placed Caleb at a crossroads, and he knew it. He could use the full weight of his position to destroy Angela Brooks, to ensure she never worked again, to make an example of her in the most public and permanent way available to him. The impulse was there, and it would have been understandable. She had humiliated him in front of a cabin full of strangers, and tried to have him detained for the crime of not looking wealthy enough. No one would have blamed him for wanting her erased. But Caleb had learned in rooms where the two were easy to confuse the difference between justice and revenge. He understood that if he used his power simply to crush one woman, he would prove nothing except that power decides who suffers, which was the very logic that had created the moment in the first place. Angela had treated him as less than human because she believed she held the power in their encounter. He had no interest in winning the argument by becoming the same thing she had been. So when the airline's leadership finally reached him, anxious and apologetic, prepared to offer whatever it took to make the story disappear, Caleb gave them an answer they did not expect. He told them he had no interest in personally destroying the attendant involved, and no interest in a quiet settlement that would bury the matter. What he wanted instead was an honest reckoning, one that addressed not just a single employee, but the conditions that had allowed her behavior to go unexamined for as long as it had. He asked for a fair and thorough investigation, one that would examine the incident on its actual merits, rather than rushing to either protect the company or sacrifice a scapegoat. And he asked for something larger, that the airline commit to retraining its entire customer service organization on unconscious bias and on the basic principle that respect was not a privilege to be earned through appearance, but a standard owed to every passenger who walked through the door. He framed it not as a punishment, but as the only response that would actually mean anything. The leadership relieved that the man who could have demanded their heads was instead asking them to be better agreed. In the days that followed, the airline issued a public apology that did not hide behind corporate language. It acknowledged plainly that a passenger had been treated with contempt because of how he appeared, that this was a failure not only of one individual, but of a culture that had allowed such judgments to pass for diligence. It announced a comprehensive overhaul of its passenger handling procedures, and a new program for evaluating employee conduct with real consequences attached. Angela Brooks faced the results of her own actions. The internal inquiry reviewing the video alongside the accounts of her colleagues and the complaints that had resurfaced concluded what the footage had already made obvious. She was suspended from duty, and the pattern of behavior that emerged from the investigation ensured that the suspension would not be a brief one. The career she had believed was protected by seniority, and the language of protocol came apart in a matter of days, and there was no one to blame for it but the version of herself she had carried into that cabin. What struck her most in the quiet that followed was not the loss of the job itself. It was the slow, unwelcome understanding of how she had lost it. She had spent 15 years certain that she could read a person's worth at a glance, certain that her judgments were a form of professional skill rather than prejudice dressed up as duty. The man in the worn sweater had not destroyed her. Her power over him had been an illusion from the start. What had destroyed her was the arrogance she had mistaken for competence, the bias she had nursed for so long that she could no longer see it as anything but the truth. She replayed the flight in her mind more times than she could count, and each time she arrived at the same image the moment she had looked at Caleb Lawson and decided before he had said a single word that he did not belong. Everything after that, the accusation, the torn ticket, the call to security had flowed from that one instant of contempt. She had built her certainty on a foundation of assumption, and certainty, built on assumption she now understood, always collapses faster than the person standing on it expects. For Caleb, the resolution brought no sense of victory, only a familiar quiet. He had not sought any of it, and he took no satisfaction in Angela's downfall, even as he believed the investigation had reached the right conclusion. What mattered to him was that the response had been aimed at something larger than a single person, that the company had been pushed, however reluctantly, toward treating its passengers as people first. If anything good was to come from the humiliation he had endured, it would be that. In the weeks that followed, as the story slowly faded from the public's attention, one detail proved more durable than all the rest. It was not the footage of Angela tearing the ticket dramatic as that moment had been that people remembered longest. The clip that lingered, the one shared and reshared until it became the true emblem of the whole affair, was a quieter one. It was the footage captured by Diane Foster from several rows back, of what Caleb had done in the final minutes before landing after the captain had spoken his name. In that clip, Caleb Lawson rose from seat 2. A knelt down in the aisle and gathered the torn pieces of his own ticket from the carpet one by one with unhurried care. He collected them not in anger and not for show, but with the simple dignity of a man cleaning up something that had been broken in front of him. The cabin around him was utterly silent, every passenger watching, and in that silence, the image said more than any speech could have. A man who had been told he was worthless, quietly restoring a small piece of order to the world, asking nothing of anyone. That was the picture that stayed, long after the policy changes were announced, and the apology was filed away long after Angela Brooks had vanished from the public eye. People remembered the man kneeling in the aisle of a first-class cabin, picking up the pieces of the ticket a stranger had decided he did not deserve to hold. It was an image entirely without cruelty, and that was precisely why it cut so deeply against the cruelty that had produced it. Caleb left the airport the way he had arrived, in the same plain dark sweater and worn shoes, carrying the same canvas bag, indistinguishable from any other traveler, making his way toward the exit. The difference was only in the eyes that followed him now. Where there had once been contempt or indifference, there was something closer to recognition, a quiet awareness among those who knew the story that the most powerful person to pass through that terminal had looked the entire time, exactly like someone they might have overlooked. He did not give interviews. He did not write a statement of his own. He returned to his work and to the private life he guarded carefully, and he allowed the changes he had asked for to speak in his place. In the months that came, The airline's retraining program took hold in ways that were difficult to measure, but real small shifts in how passengers were greeted and treated, a slow loosening of the assumption that worth could be read off a person's clothing. It wasn't a revolution. It was something quieter and more lasting than that. The story in the end was never really about a torn ticket or a ruined career, though those were the events that carried it. It was about the oldest and most ordinary kind of mistake, the assumption that the surface of a person is the truth of them, and the discovery, always arriving too late, that it never is. Angela Brooks had spent a career believing she could see who mattered. She had been looking at one of them the whole time and had seen nothing at all, and so the lesson settled plainly without ornament. Never measure the worth of a person by their appearance, because arrogance built on prejudice always collapses faster than anyone expects. Respect was never meant to be reserved for the powerful or the polished. It was meant for everyone, the man in the tailored suit and the man in the worn sweater alike, because there is no reliable way to tell from the outside which of them holds the power to change your life, and no good reason that you should need to know before deciding to treat them as human. The aircraft that had carried them both was long since cleaned and turned around, flying somewhere else, by then full of new passengers with their own assumptions about one another. But for the people who had been aboard that morning, something had shifted that would not shift back. They had watched a man be told he was nothing, and they had watched him answer by kneeling to gather the pieces of what had been broken, and they had understood, in a way no lecture could have taught them, exactly which of the two people in that cabin had been worth respecting all along.